morning. We are so thankful that you have decided to join us here online this morning. Today, we will be continuing in our series At the Movies. If you are new here at Lake Sawyer, we want to invite you to a very special event happening online. On July 28th at 6 p.m., we are hosting an online dinner with our lead pastor called Next. This is a casual 10 to 20 minute conversation held on Zoom where we'll share a little bit about who we are and help you discover your next step at Lake Sawyer. When you complete your RSVP, we will email you a Zoom link and calendar invitation. Plus, we'll even take care of dinner delivery for you. You can get your meal DoorDashed and take some time to sit down and chat with Mike instead of cooking or doing the dishes. To sign up, click the link in the chat channel or go to lakesawyerchurch.org/next. We would love the chance to tell you about Lake Sawyer and all that God is doing through this community, but more importantly, we want to get to know you. This morning, we're going to sing a few songs together, take communion, and hear a great message. My name is Maddie. Welcome to Lake Sawyer.
Search the world, it couldn't fail me. And there's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together.
Each week as a community, we take what is called communion. The night before Jesus went to the cross, he gathered his disciples, broke bread to symbolize his body that was given for us. He then took the cup and told us that it represents his blood that was freely poured out for us. As a community of Jesus followers, we take communion to remember him and the sacrifice he made for us so that we could choose to be in a relationship with him. If you haven't come to the point in your spiritual journey where you feel comfortable taking communion, please don't feel any pressure to do so. To be clear, you do not have to believe yet to be welcomed here at Lake Sawyer. We are honored that we get to be a part of your spiritual journey and will do everything we can to answer any questions you may have. If you do have questions at any time in the service, just press the live prayer button and someone will join you in a private chat window. For the rest of us, grab some bread and some juice, and in the next minute or so, take communion wherever you are.
I don't know what's coming, but I know you're good. I don't know what the future holds, but I know you're strong. You're strong. I trust you now, I trust you always, in every season. I trust you now, I trust you always, in every moment. And I have tasted it, I have seen again and again. You're good. Oh, you've been my strength when I was weak. Again and again. You're strong. You're strong. I trust you now, I trust you always, in every season. I trust you now, I trust you always, in every moment. I trust you now, I trust you always, in every season. I trust you now, I trust you always, in every moment. 'Cause you're strong. 'Cause you're strong. Be strong in me. Yes, you're strong. Be strong in me. trust you always, in every season. I trust you now. I trust you always, in every moment.
Through recent times, we have found new ways to serve our community as we continue to work to help people find and follow Jesus. For those of you who already give to Lake Sawyer, thank you for continuing to partner with us in your faithful generosity. You are making a difference in our community, and if you'd like to give, you can do so by going to our website at lakesawyerchurch.org/give, or you can text Lake Sawyer to 77977. You can also go to our Lake Sawyer app, which is available on your preferred app store. In this season, most churches, including Lake Sawyer, are doing reasonably well at creating an online experience for worship and groups, but are struggling with the challenge of connecting those who need help with those who are willing to help. As a result, we are grateful to be joining multiple churches in our local area in a collective effort to do just this through a program and website called Helper. Helper stands for Help Enable Local Pandemic Response. The main goal of Helper is to connect those who are in our community with those who are willing to help in this season. Please take some time to visit helperwa.org to find or offer help today. Now, let's toss the service over to Mike as we continue in our current series, At the Movies.
This weekend, we're continuing in our series, At the Movies. If you're with us last week, you know that we talked about the last installment of Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker. I told you, I love that movie. I may or may not have rewatched that movie this past week. Okay, I rewatched the movie with my family this past week. But I love that whole movie, and the scene we talked about really served to set the backdrop for the reality that we talked about, that God wants to use ordinary people, people like you and me, to do extraordinary things in our world today. And the reality is the only thing that we have to do is to be willing to surrender our lives and to allow God to write incredible stories with each of us. And to wrestle with the reality of whether or not we're willing to do that, to trust God in the story that He wants to write through us. If you weren't with us last week and didn't get a chance to watch that message, I'd encourage you to go to our website, lakesawyerchurch.org. You can watch the message there, or you can go to our YouTube channel. Subscribe to that channel to make sure you get not just last week's message, but you're up to date on everything that we're putting out, and you can follow along or catch up right there at YouTube. This week, we're going to be continuing in our series, and we're going to shift from the Star Wars franchise to the Marvel universe. And I got to be honest a little bit, when it comes to Marvel, I'm a little bit outside my element. Like Star Wars, I'm good with Star Wars. I know Star Wars. But when it comes to Marvel, it's more of like I've picked and chosen certain movies to watch. I've dabbled around in the Marvel universe. I've seen some, but yet I've ignored others. And I know that's going to be hard, especially for those hardcore Marvel fans that are tuning in. Matter of fact, we have someone on staff who's a Marvel fanatic. And when the last movie, Endgame, came out, I remember going to her and saying, okay, to prepare myself to go see Endgame, which Marvel movies do I need to absolutely make sure that I see so I can understand everything that's happening in Endgame? And her response, was all 23 of them. To watch all 23 movies to be able to understand what was about to unfold in Endgame. And did you realize how crazy that is? That's over 3,015 minutes of movies. Over 50 hours. Like, I was supposed to watch 50 hours of movies to understand Endgame. Needless to say, I didn't do it. I didn't watch them all. And I know for Marvel fans, that seems like a crime. My wife is one of those Marvel fans. My wife, she's seen all 23 of those movies. They're really not in my wheelhouse, but they're absolutely in her wheelhouse. When Endgame came out, she went to the theater by herself to watch the movie. Now, it wasn't that I'm like a bad husband and that I didn't want to go with her. The reality was she couldn't wait and she wanted to be there. I had work and she probably knew if I was there, I was going to pester her with questions from not understanding the things that I was missing because I hadn't watched all 23 movies. When the movie finally did come out for home viewing, we rented it. And the two of us, we sat down, she rewatched it, I watched it for the first time, and I'm gonna tell you, it was a great movie. It was a really, really good movie. I enjoyed it, and I probably didn't understand every nuance and every piece of the movie, but I got most of it. I enjoyed the movie so much that as I prepared for this weekend, I watched the movie again. Now, I know you're probably thinking, that's 2 movies in a week, Mike. You watch way too much TV. But hey, I was on vacation for the first part of this week, so that's my justification for watching a lot of movies. But as I prepared for this weekend, as I rewatched the movie, I was struck by one scene, and that's the scene that I want us to talk about today. So without further ado, Avengers Endgame. That is such a great scene. As we watch that scene, as it unfolds, the characters are coming to grips with the reality that their friend, Black Widow, would not be returning from the mission that they were just on. And as they are coming to grips with that reality, they're experiencing grief and deep sorrow that comes from the loss, in this particular case, of someone who meant so much to them. And I wanted to use that as the backdrop, again, today to talk about the reality of grief. That all of us in our lives, we experience grief. Grief from the loss of someone or something that's important to us. It's a universal thing. What I want us to talk about, though, is how do we process through that grief? How do we make sense of everything that we're experiencing? And I'm sure somewhere along the way, you've probably heard someone talk about grief and have mentioned the 5 stages of grief. It's a pretty common, popular concept that is tied with grief. Can you name the 5 stages of grief? Go ahead and take a moment, see if you can name them. Some of you are probably like, that was the longest 5 seconds of my life. In case you didn't get them all, or just to ensure that you make sure you got them all correct, here are the 5 stages of grief. Number 1, denial. Number 2, anger. Number 3, bargaining. Number 4, depression. And the last one, number 5, acceptance. This framework for understanding grief was developed by the Swiss-American psychiatrist Elizabeth Kluber-Ross. It came from her observation, her work of years dealing with terminally ill patients and documenting their journey through it, documenting their experience and the grief and their realities as they walked through this season of her life. In many ways, Dr. Kluber's work has become the bedrock for how we understand and make sense and interpret grief in our life. It's not something that just plays out in our mind. It's not something that we just experience when we go through these difficult seasons. It's also the kind of things that we see play out in the movies of our lives. I mean, literally, it's what we just saw play out in the movie Endgame. Let's just rewind real quick and kind of put some teeth to that idea. In that scene, you saw Thor. If you don't know who Thor is, Thor's the long-haired guy in the bathrobe, that guy. Thor is really, really wrestling with the loss of Black Widow. For him, there's denial. He doesn't want to believe that Black Widow is actually dead. Stage one. Then we see Hulk. You know who Hulk is. Hulk's the big green guy. And what does Hulk do in that scene? Hulk does what Hulk always does. He gets angry and he throws a bench across the lake. Stage two. Captain America, the clean-cut guy, helps us understand what bargaining looks like. I mean, he vows to ensure that Black Widow's life, her sacrifice, would be worth it. That her life would not be lost in vain. And then there's Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man doesn't actually say a word. Instead, what Iron Man does is he internalizes his emotions and is dealing with his depression. Stage number 4. And then lastly, there's Hawkeye. Hawkeye is a character that's standing off, helping people process it together. Hawkeye has accepted the reality that Black Widow wasn't coming back. That there was nothing that they could do. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. All of them play out in that scene. And while our understanding of grief has grown and adapted from Kluber-Ross's influential work, its core principles and understanding grief still resonate in our lives today. Many of us can recall times or in seasons where we have experienced grief and some of those stages, some of the emotions that come along with it. Now, maybe we haven't experienced all 5 of those stages, but I know all of us can relate to one of them. Maybe some of you are experiencing one of those stages of grief right now. And that wouldn't surprise me. Because the truth is, this is a season that is ripe with grief. This is a season where we have experienced loss. Some of us have lost loved ones. Some of us have come close to saying goodbye to our loved ones. All of us, in some way, shape, or form, we have grieved a way of life that has been lost. Going out to restaurants in this season, it looks different. Work looks different. Relationships looks different. Sports, they look different. Your face, it looks different. We're wearing masks across our face. It's a different season, and many of us in this season long for the way that life used to be. We grieve those realities and the life that was lost. For many of us who have kids at home, this week brought another season of loss. As a couple school districts locally announced that starting in the fall, all of our kids would attend school online only, that there would be no physical classes. And when we got that news, the natural response for many of us was grief. Some of us grieved the loss for our kids. Some of us grieved the loss for ourselves. And what happens in these seasons, and what happens in times and moments of grief, and this is what I've experienced in my own life, what happens is we tend to minimize the grief. We attempt to ignore it altogether. Like if I bury it down deep enough, it will go away and it will never come up to the surface, only to realize at some point that grief always works its way to the surface. Or what we do, and I have a tendency to do this, we hyper-spiritualize our experience of grief. We tell ourselves, well, grief is a byproduct of our faith. Probably more clearly, our grief is a byproduct of our lack of faith. That somehow if I believed God was in charge, if I believed that God was in control, that God knew, then I wouldn't be grieving. And so the fact that I'm grieving somehow in some way says that I do not have enough faith in this season. So we try to make it about a spiritual deficiency that we have. I know that that's not just something I have dealt with. My guess is it's something that many of us have at one point thought in our lives. But here's what I want us to understand. And it's so important. Just to set the stage as we talk the rest of the time about grief. Grief is not only real. It's real. It's also right. And I know that can be hard for us, especially for some of us who've just buried it or considered it a spiritual deficiency. Grief is real, and grief is also right. It's not a reflection on some deficiency that we have as human beings or as followers of Jesus. You see, God gave us a heart with the capacity to love in extravagant ways, but that heart also has the capacity to grieve when those ways and those people are lost. Grief is not anti-God or anti-human. It's a natural part of life. I want to say that again. Grief is not anti-God or anti-human. It is a natural part of life. But for those of us who are tuning in, who've placed our lives in Jesus, for those of us who look to Jesus, the Bible does tell us that there is a way that we should process the grief that we're experiencing, a way that is a little bit different than how it's handled in the world at large. This is what the Apostle Paul writes to the church in the port city of Thessalonica, a city in the ancient world. We read these words in 1 Thessalonians, beginning in chapter 4, in verse 13 and 14. This is what he writes. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. Don't be uninformed about what's happened to these people, like everybody else, because you have something, we have something as followers of Jesus that they don't. We have perspective, we have hope. Now, the truth is, yes, Paul is talking about in this verse the grief that comes from losing someone that is loved in your life. But the application of Paul's point is so much broader. What he's saying is that when we grieve, again, we shouldn't grieve like the rest of the world because we have an assurance. We have a security about us. We have an eternal perspective, which is exactly what he says here in verse 14. What's that perspective? For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep with him. That our perspective, our perception of how we navigate seasons of grief is different because we have Jesus. We have knowledge and we have firsthand experience of what he did and what he continues to do in our lives and the lives of people around us. It's a perspective that is based on a God who's continually at work and an understanding that this grief that we experience in our lives in this moment is not the final chapter. It will not be the final word. Because God is at work amid our loss. He's at work. But this is so key. And if you kind of wandered off for just a second, tune back in real quick here. This is so key. It doesn't mean that in these seasons, we just grit our teeth and bear it. That's not how we get through it. The perspective isn't that God is at work, so just grit your teeth and get through it, which is my tendency in difficult seasons. It's my tendency to just put my head down and push through. Can you relate to that? Is that your tendency as well? If that's your tendency, it's my tendency, I want us to understand that that's not how we should handle grief. When it comes to our grief, the response isn't just grit our teeth and bear it. The perspective we should have in grief is a perspective that encourages us to acknowledge where we're at and be willing to turn to Jesus, to turn to him, and to lean on him in this difficult season. And that's something I think so easily gets lost. Seasons of grief encourages us to turn to God. And here's an example from my own life. I have shared this in the past. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I grew up in a home with parents who had Christian foundations, but going to church, talking about God, it wasn't really part of my reality. My foundation, my bedrock, were my parents. It was my family. Towards the end of my elementary school years, I remember getting out of school one day, and my dad informed me that him and my mom were going to be getting a divorce. I mean, this was the kind of news that completely shatters a kid's world. I mean, I didn't even know what to do with it. What I did know is that everything I expected, the foundation that I had, was crumbling around me. It was devastating news. A couple weeks after my dad shared this with me, I remember I was staying home from school. I was sick. I was laying in bed. I wasn't feeling good. I was kind of there in bed all day. And at some point as I laid there in bed, I looked up on my bookshelf and I noticed there was a Bible. It was a small Bible. It was one of the Bibles with the New Testament and the Book of Psalms. And I remember I seeing that and I thought to myself, oh, that's weird. I've never seen this book there in my entire life. And sure, I don't know where it came from. It's probably always been there, but it was just never something that was what kind of stood out to me. It wasn't something that I was drawn to. But yet, as I laid in bed that day, I remember looking at that book and thinking, I need to read it. And so I reached up and I grabbed the New Testament and I opened it up and I saw there was a bunch of names at the tops of the pages. I didn't have any context to what the names were for, but one of them was John. And I thought, hey, my grandpa's name is John, and so this is a great book to read. And so I opened up to John, and I began reading through the pages of John. And that afternoon, I read through the entire Gospel of John. It was my first real interaction to who Jesus was. It was my interaction or introduction to what Jesus could do and what he could mean for me in my life. And in that moment, in that season of grief, in ways I never thought possible or ever imagined, I found myself leaning on God to help get me through this difficult moment of my life. And that probably doesn't surprise you, because here's what we know, that God is always with us in our difficult times. God is with us in general, but he doesn't leave us in our difficult seasons. The problem is most of us, we're just not looking for him in our grief. We're not looking for God in those moments because, again, what have we done? We've made it a spiritual weakness. That we don't want to admit our struggles and our grief to God because we think somehow that makes us deficient as people and as Christ followers. But God is always near. God is near the brokenhearted in each and every season. I mean, let's look real quick. Look what the writer of Psalm 34 puts. And I hope this brings some encouragement and perspective to you. This is what we read in Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Those are so powerful. Those words are so powerful. Matter of fact, I want to repeat them to you again. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. It reminds us that God cares deeply about our experience. He cares about our struggle. He cares about our pain. He cares about our uncertainty. And he is present with us in each and every one of those moments. That God does not leave us, nor does God forsake us. That he is a loving and caring God. And as a matter of fact, he loved you and he loved me. He loved everyone so much that he was willing to send his son Jesus for us, so that all of us would not have to experience the ultimate grief that would come from an eternity separated from him. This is what we call good news. That God loved you, that he loved me so much that he sent his son after us. He sent his son for us to meet us in our brokenhearted times, to meet us in our grief. But here's the thing, God just doesn't want to meet us in our grief. He also wants to heal our wounds. This is what we read in Psalm 147, beginning in verse 3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. That Jesus doesn't just meet us, but he heals our broken heart. He binds our wounds. He wants to see us through it. Now, that is both encouraging and frustrating. Now hear me out. It's encouraging because it reminds us in the most difficult times that God is with us, that God is working in us. It reminds us that he is the great shepherd. And as the shepherd, he will see us through this season. That's incredibly encouraging. But it's also difficult because the reality is when we are in seasons of grief, when we're going through difficult times in our lives, it always seems too long. This COVID season seems way too long. Like, I cannot believe we're barely halfway through 2020. Like, this is the longest year ever. And these are the seasons, and the times and the seasons of grief, these are the moments when we want God to act quickly, to fix this, to take away our grief, to end the season of loss and despair. And when it doesn't happen on our timeline or as quickly as we want it to, you know what happens? You know what our response is? Of course you know what our response is. We get frustrated. We get incredibly frustrated because we don't like it. We don't like the discomfort. We want God to end this season now. But notice what the passage doesn't say. It doesn't say that God will heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds today or tomorrow. It simply says that it will happen. That it will happen in time. And so what we do in these seasons, what we have to be willing to do is to trust the process. To trust the work that God is doing in you and me, which I get is not easy. But I promise you, it's worth it. Especially if we can maintain a healthy perspective. If we can recognize the potential that our grieving provides for us to draw closer to God. It's not easy, but it is possible. And how do I know that it's possible? Because we see it happen again and again through the pages of Scripture. Here's one example. Psalm 119, verse 71. Listen what the psalmist here says. It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. The psalmist looks at this and goes, look, I recognize that the struggle that I have, my affliction, has helped me lean into you, to learn your word, to learn your decrees, that this season of affliction has only deepened my understanding of you and your word. It's possible. It's not easy, but it's possible that when we go through seasons of grief, the same thing can be true of us. But we have to be willing to wait. We have to be willing to wait on God, who promises us to see us through our struggles. He promises to see us through our grief, which is exactly what King David did. Look what King David wrote in Psalm 40, beginning in verse 1. He said, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Now the thing is, we don't know the specifics of David's struggle in this season. We don't know what put him in this place. What we do know is he's found himself in the pit. And all of us can relate to what life feels like in the pit. Seasons of grief feel like we're living life in a huge, giant pit. We don't know what got David into that pit, but we do know that he wasn't there forever. That's not where his story ends. Because eventually, in God's timing, God acted. God rescued David. And it wasn't something that David could control. He couldn't define when God would move. He couldn't define how God would move. The only thing David could do was focus on the things that David had control over. And that was his ability to wait and his willingness to lean into God, even when he found himself in the pit of despair. That this season of distress and heartache would only serve to deepen his faith and his understanding of God. And guys, that's possible for us as well. That the grief we experience, the loss that we experience, whether it's from this season or in any season, with the right perspective, it can draw us closer to the only one who can bring us the healing that we desperately want. And that is true no matter what you are going through. No matter what you're experiencing, this isn't, I promise you, this is not the last chapter. That God isn't the one who caused your grief. But I believe with all my heart that God is there with you in the midst of your grief. He's asking you to trust him. He wants you to lean on him, to draw closer to him, and at just the right time. And that's the thing, with God's time, it's always mysterious, but at just the right time. His word promises us that he will heal our broken hearts. He will bind up our wounds. And when that happens, I know we will all declare the same words that David declared when he said this in Psalm 30, beginning in verse 10. You know what it looks like to come through seasons in life of despair, seasons of life of grief? David tells us, he says, "You turned my wailing into dancing. You turned my grief into something so much more. You removed my sackcloth. You clothed me with joy, that my heart may sing your praises and not be silent. Lord, my God, I will praise you forever." May that be the cry of our hearts. May God turn our grief into joy. May he turn our mourning into dancing, because I know, and I hope you know, that he's the only one who will see us through this season. He's the only one who can help use these difficult moments to make us stronger, to make us better. But we have to trust him, and we have to lean into him. So my prayer for you is that in this season, and in every season of grief, you'd be willing to look to God and find your strength and your support from him. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for the time that we have together. And I thank you for things like movies that help set stages for conversation around an important topic like grief. And God, I pray that we would know that it's not only real, but it's right, God, and that you will use these times in our lives to be catalysts for growth. And it's hard to see. It's so hard to see when we experience the pain of these seasons. But God, I pray that as we open our eyes in the pit, we find you there with us. And we're drawn to you. We lean on you. And we trust in your timing to see us through it. That you will take our grief, and at some point, in just the right time, you'll turn it into joy. We thank you for Jesus, for your Son, and for all that he does and he means. It's because of him that we have been given a pathway to freedom and to life. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for the great message, Mike. We hope you enjoyed the service today. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date on all of our latest information. Last week, we had our first in-person services, and it was so good to see some of you. If you would like to attend an in-person service, registration is now live for next Sunday. We can't wait to see some of you next week in our in-person services. Otherwise, we will see you right here next week. We hope you have an incredible week.
Bye.